So we've now made our piping and our decorative piping for the quilt, and I want to show you how we're going to attach it to the quilt and how to get it to line up perfectly with the binding. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the piping using the number 23 foot, which is the applique foot, but we call it a piping foot now. We're going to use that to attach it to the edge of the quilt. So remember, we took our piping and we trimmed it with the piping ruler, and now it's exactly the right width. We're still going to use the 23 foot. We're going to line up the raw edges of the piping that we've made, and we're going to move our 23 foot, we're going to move our needle with our 23 foot. We're going to move the needle to 3 positions to the right of center. So now the raw edge is to the right, so we have to move the needle 3 positions towards the raw edge. When we made the piping, the raw edge was to the left, and we moved the needle position 3 positions to the left. The other thing that's really important is, if you'll remember, we started with the cording long, and you want to make sure that those are over the edges. There's a little trick that we have to do before we can finish all of this, and I'll show that to you here in just a second. But right now I'm just matching up the raw edges of my piping with the raw edges of my quilt and sewing that on with the number 23 foot. What you'll notice when you're doing this is that your stitch is going to line up exactly with the stitch that we sewed when we made the piping. The next thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to attach the piping and fix the corners so that there's no bulk. You can see that when you're putting the piping down, there's quite a bit of bulk at this corner 1/4 inch. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach the piping on 2 of the sides, so on the left side and the right side, or on the top and bottom, it doesn't matter which. And then we have to fix the corners before we can attach the other side. So what you need to do is you have to pull the threads back out. You have to unstitch this. I like to use my tweezer points because they're very sharp and I can get that thread loose quickly. So what we're going to do is I trimmed the edge of it even with the quilt, and I'm going to use my tweezers, the sharp point of my tweezers, and I'm just going to pull the threads out a little bit, because what we need to do is we need to cut this cording back behind the 1/4 inch seam so that we don't have bulk in that corner when we add the next piece of piping and our binding. So I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut. Be careful that you don't cut the piping fabric. Pull this out just a little bit, and we're just going to trim this back. We're going to trim it back so we've cut all that bulk out of the corner there. And so now all we have here is just flat fabric. There's no piping in that corner. We're going to do the same thing with the next one. And before we start to attach it, we're going to trim it. Take our tweezers and pull those threads back. Now normally I would have matching threads, but in order for you to see this, I put it in the background. I put it in a lighter color on the back side. And I'm just going to pull this back, and I'm going to trim the piping 1/4 inch before we sew it down. So we're just going to cut that out. When you get to the other end, you can just sew it down. So now with that 1/4 inch cut out, I can put my piping right on the edge, and there's no bulk in the corner. There's no bulk in this corner where we're going to attach our binding. Okay, let's get that part all done. All 4 corners are going to be the same way. Now we've attached our piping on all 4 sides, and remember to cut out your corners so that they're nice and flat when you sew them down. We don't want the bulk of that piping cording in the corners when we attach our binding. We're ready to attach our binding, and we're still going to use the number 23 foot. If you lay your binding down on the edge of your quilt, you're going to feel the bump of the piping. And you want to find where that is, and we're going to continue to use our number 23 foot, and that 23 foot is going to go right over the piping. The only adjustment that you have to make on the settings is, if you remember, we made our piping with the needle in the number 3 position, either to the right or the left, depending on how you set it up. And then when we attached the piping to the quilt, we used the needle position 3 to the right in order to get it to sew in exactly the same position that we created the piping. Now we're going to move our needle position just 2 to the right. If we leave it at 3 to the right and you fold your binding over, you're going to see the stitching from the piping. And the goal is not to see the stitching, it's to see the decorative piping. So it also, at the same time, will pull that piping really tight to your binding. And I'm going to show you how to sew the corner with a trick on how to make the turn. So I have made sure that my piping is underneath the little groove in the number 23 foot. So I'm not paying attention to whether it's a 1/4 inch seam or not, because I already know I have a 1/4 inch seam, because that's how I trimmed it with my ruler, my piping ruler. And I'm going to sew with my needle position 2 to the right of center. And here we go. I'm going to stop before I get to the 1/4 inch. And I'm just making sure that my corner is lined up correctly. The front edge of the foot, number 23 foot, is actually about, it's a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch, but not quite 3/8. So I'm gonna stop way before that. In fact, if you can look to your left as your needle goes around, if you stop right about where the piping starts, that's a really great place. And then we want to back tack here. Just push your reverse button. And we're going to trim that. Now, when I turn, get my binding where I can work with it. When I make the turn, I'm going to fold it straight up so that my outside edges of my binding are a straight line. If your binding is more like this, where it's off and you have more binding than you have quilt, then you need to back your stitches out a little bit. You've sewn too far. So the goal is to get your binding to line up, when you have it folded, to line up exactly with the edge of your quilt. That tells you that it's a good turn and you're going to have enough fabric there to make that happen. Once you've determined that you have it folded correctly, and this diagonal line will go right off the edge of the quilt there. Once you have that determined, fold it down again. And this time, we're going to make sure that the fold is just above the edge of the quilt. So that fold is just a little tiny bit above the edge of the quilt. You don't want a lot, because then it'll bulk up in there. But we're going to go put our quilt back into the sewing machine. And I want you to start about 1/2 inch down. And this is a little bit of a trick that I learned a long time ago, because I don't like it when you're sewing and the corners get either flipped under and you've made more bulk, or you just can't quite catch them. So what I do is I start about 1/2 inch down, and again we're going to make sure that that piping is underneath the foot, so I can feel it with my fingernails on either side here, so it's right in the middle of that channel. And what I do is I start with reverse first, and I actually back off the edge of the quilt and then go forward. And I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second. And it's really important that you keep your work tidy. So now the corner of my quilt doesn't have any turns or buckles in it. It's clean as can be. And when we turn this over on the back side, it's going to miter perfectly. It's going to miter absolutely perfectly. No bulk. And it's set up with the right amount of fabric on both sides. And more importantly, on the front edge, the piping is super tight next to the binding. This is such an incredible look on your quilt, and it will add just enough pep and decorative value to your quilt to make it absolutely beautiful. It's just that one extra step that makes it that much better. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and ring the bell to be notified of new products and how-to videos.